Hi, welcome to A Gray Barn Rising. I'm reading the poems this evening of the American poet William Stafford. He lived from 1914 to 1993. He was born in Hutchinson, Kansas, and he's spent his life writing about the area in which he grew up and also the Northwest coast, because he spent many years in Oregon, where he taught at Lewis and Clark College. He began teaching there in 1947. William Stafford was a conscientious objector during World War II. He was drafted in 1941, and he spent the years 1942 through about 1946 working in forestry in Arkansas, in California, and Illinois. Interesting piece of trivia is he was paid $2.50 a month during that service. So he's a poet, often known as a pacifist poet, a poet of deep profundity. His work is extraordinarily accessible and available, and yet it moves beyond simplicity into something that is often significant and deeply profound. I'd like to begin by reading one of his most famous poems from his first full-length book, Traveling Through the Dark, and this is the title poem. I have an early edition of this book, and I want to read from that edition. This book appeared, I believe, in 1962, but he won the National Book Award in Poetry for it in 1963. Traveling Through the Dark. Traveling through the dark, I found a deer dead on the edge of the Wilson River Road. It is usually best to roll them into the canyon. That road is narrow. To swerve might make more dead. By glow of the tail light, I stumbled back of the car and stood by the heap, a doe, a recent killing. She had stiffened already, almost cold. I dragged her off. She was large in the belly. My fingers touching her side brought me the reason. Her side was warm. Her fawn lay there waiting, alive, still, never to be born. Beside that mountain road, I hesitated. The car aimed ahead its lowered parking lights. Under the hood purred the steady engine. I stood in the glare of the warm exhaust, turning red. Around our group, I could hear the wilderness listen. I thought hard for us all, my only swerving, then pushed her over the edge into the river. Such a powerful poem chronicling the choices that we need to make in life. From the same book, a poem called Late at Night. Falling separate into the dark, the hailstone yelps of geese pattered through our roof. Startled, we listened. Those V's of direction swept by unseen, so orderly that we paused. But then, faltering back through their circle, they came. Were they lost up there in the night? They always knew the way, we thought. You looked at me across the room. We live in a terrible season. I'd like to move now to another early book of Stafford's, The Rescued Year. I mentioned that he was born in Hutchinson, Kansas, and he writes a lot about Kansas. I'd like to give you this poem, Across Kansas. My family slept those level miles, but like a bell rung deep till dawn, I drove down an aisle of sound. Nothing real, but in the bell, past the town where I was born. Once you cross a land like that, you own your face more. What the light struck told a self. Every rock denied all the rest of the world. We stopped at Sharon Springs and ate. My state still dark, my dream too long to tell. Part of what happens in a Stafford poem is that through the accretion of images, the details are both specific and expansive, almost universal at the same time. I'm thinking about that last poem, My State Still Dark. I mean, it's the state of Kansas, but it's also his emotional, his psychological state. And I really love that about a Stafford poem. This book, Writing the Australian Crawl, I found in March of 1981. I devoured the book, read it in a night or a night and a half. And it's a wonderful book. The subtitle is Views on the Writer's Vocation. And it includes essays about writing, statements about writing from Stafford, interviews. It's a wonderful book about what it means to have a writer's life. There are a few poems in this book. Some of them are collected elsewhere. There's a poem here that I have not come across in the collections of his that I have. There are only a few poems in this book. I'd like to read this poem for you. It's about a child's game, Run Sheep Run, but again, just like I said, this is an example of a poem that takes on a greater profundity. Run Sheep Run. Once when we hid, no one ever found us. It all changed into this kind of world. Your picture repeated wherever I turn, but none of them you. And I can't find my way back into our story. This is how it is in our town. Our house faces north. In the yard, a few relics. I stand a long time by the gate and imagine. It is cold. It is evening. When the stars begin, I run away over the snow, zigzagging as fast as I can. But wherever I turn, it is the world. It is time to give up. Wherever the others went, this is home. I just adore that poem. You know, one of the things Stafford says in Writing the Australian Crawl in one of the interviews is, or perhaps it's in an essay, I can't recall, but he says, the voice I hear in my poems is the voice of my mother and not the voice of T.S. Eliot. And I had the opportunity, Marianne and I had the opportunity to interview him in 1981, fall of 1981, when he came to Colorado State University. And I asked him about that quote and to expand upon it. And he talked about how can you ever erase those early voices that inform you? We often think that we're influenced by great writers, and many of us are, but we're also influenced by the simplicity of everyday voices and the voices that have shaped us. And I hear that in Stafford's work, that I talked about its accessibility and its availability, and yet it moves from common language, common discourse, into something, as I said, often more profound. This from A Glass Face in the Rain. I want to read a quirky little poem. Stafford often includes humor, bits of humor in his work, and again mixed with the seriousness, a kind of deep play, as anthropologist Clifford Geertz might refer to in other contexts. This is called Things I Learned Last Week. Ants, when they meet each other, usually pass on the right. Sometimes you can open a sticky door with your elbow. A man in Boston has dedicated himself to telling about injustice. For $3,000 he will come to your town and tell you about it. Schopenhauer was a pessimist, but he played the flute. Yeats, Pound, and Eliot saw art as growing from other art. They studied that. If I ever die, I'd like it to be in the evening. That way, I'll have all the dark to go with me, and no one will see how I begin to hobble along. In the Pentagon, one person's job is to take pins out of towns, hills, and fields, and then save the pins for later. Those last two stanzas, the strange line in that second to last stanza, if I ever die. I love that conditional phrase there. And then that powerful closing about the Pentagon. I'd like to move now to an early new and collected poems, stories that could be true. I'd like to give you a poem from here called, as one of the great titles, one of the great William Stafford titles, Things in the Wild Need Salt. Of the many histories, Earth tells only one. Earth misses many things people tell about. Like maybe there are earthquakes that we should have had, or animals that know more love than God ever felt. And we need these things. Things in the wild need salt. Once in a cave, a little bar of light fell into my hand. The walls leaned over me. I carried it outside to let the stars look. They peered in my hand. Stars are like that. Do not be afraid. I no longer carry it. But when I see a face now, splinters of that light fall and won't go out, no matter how faint. The buried star shines back there in the cave. It is in the earth wherever I walk. It is in the earth wherever I walk. Beautiful repetition of that closing line. I'd like to move now and share a couple poems with you from his new and selected poems entitled The Way It Is. Actually, I think I'll just give you one poem from this to close. This is entitled, What's in My Journal? Stafford was an avid journal writer. He kept a journal for something like 50 years. He was a very prolific poet. He wrote something like 22,000 poems, published approximately 3,000 poems, was writing all the time. And he had a practice where he would get up at something like 4:30 in the morning. And even in his advanced years, he would go jogging, and then he would come back and write, and often begin poems in his journal. I think it gave him that sense of play, that sense where he could kind of mess around a little bit. He mentions in writing The Australian Crawl, and also when I interviewed him, he mentioned that part of the reason that he was able to keep writing was that he lowered his standards, particularly in the early phases of the poem. He was being somewhat humorous, but you know, the teaching there is profound, which is to allow yourself, to allow the poem to unfold without overanalyzing too much as it's beginning to come forth and be birthed unto the world. Later you can go back and edit a poem and revise a poem, and it's a very good thing to do. He was talking about how to get the poem, how to court the poem and get it to come forward. So this is a little poem of his called What's in My Journal. Odd things like a button drawer, mean things, fish hooks, barbs in your hand, but marbles too, a genius for being agreeable, junkyard crucifixes, voluptuous discards, space for knickknacks and for Alaska, evidence to hang me or to beatify, clues that lead nowhere, that never connected anyway. Deliberate obfuscation, the kind that takes genius. Chasms in character, loud omissions, mornings that yawn above a new grave. Pages you know exist, but you can't find them. Someone's terribly inevitable life story. Maybe mine. That's a delightful poem about what's in my journal. So I read again from The Way It Is, the new and selected poems, Stories That Could Be True, which is new and collected poems, A Glass Face in the Rain, Writing the Australian Crawl, The Rescued Year, and of course his first book, Traveling Through the Dark. Stafford's poems are readily available. I would suggest getting a nice selected of his work, like The Way It Is, to read through a large swath of his material. Thank you for joining Bootsy and me for another episode of A Gray Barn Rising.